Hello, everyone, and welcome now to this third and final week reading Daniel for Advent, a chapter a day, Monday through Thursday. We left off, obviously, in chapter number 8, and therein I remarked how the tone of the book was changing. The first 7 chapters had a repetitious template. Therein there was some sort of threat by the controlling powers, and yet the Hebrews resisted or responded in a certain way, Daniel and his 3 friends, and the result ended up being that the ruler of the empire gave quite a testimony and praise to God. However, in chapter number 8, it began to turn more toward certain oracles and what we call apocalyptic literature. And here, if you're reading chapter number 9, you see that it's pretty much divided into 2 parts, these 27 verses. The first part is Daniel is praying, and Daniel's prayer is pretty is understandable. That there is he's quoting from Jeremiah. He knows what Jeremiah wrote concerning time of exile. Jeremiah was warning that things were going to change, basically that the Babylonians were going to come in, terrorize and occupy the land, destroy the temple, and put some of the people into exile for a period of 70 years. And one of the things that was going to mark the 70-year period was going to be the desolation in Jerusalem there. Jeremiah talked about this, that for 70 years they would serve the empire. And but that was in Jeremiah 25, that they would be in exile. But however, from Daniel's perspective, time has gone by. It looks like it's been about 66 years, and Daniel's concerned. He's wondering. It looks like now it's time for the exile to be complete. So Daniel's prayer is pretty well understood, and of course the people are going to return in part after these 70 years, but it's not going to quite be the same. And in response, that Daniel's going to be given an oracle in the latter part of this chapter, and this is what is called Daniel's 70 weeks. Now, they are not 70 weeks in terms of 7 days. However, they are 70 weeks in terms of years, a year of weeks. So 70 weeks of 7 years ends up being 490 years. Now, one of the things is what we've discussed last Thursday, how to read apocalyptic literature. We tend to read scripture, and a lot of people tend to read prophecy thinking that it's prophecy for us to be fulfilled in front of our eyes, and I think that's hardly the case. These prophecies were given for people in Daniel's time and those that would come relatively soon after, not a period of thousands of years later as we've come. And one of the keys to interpreting apocalyptic literature is looking at the broader context, and that being here, the people of God are in exile. There's ruling empire, but there is hope that things are going to be changed, that God is still in control. What the oracle that Daniel is going to receive is that there are these 70 weeks of 7 years, 490 years, that are determined upon the people and the holy city to which is Jerusalem, to put an end to rebellion, to end sin, atone for iniquity, bring in perpetual righteousness, to anoint the most holy place, and so on and so forth. And the language is very cryptic. It's been the source of a great many writings, a ton of debate, and I think it's very hard for us to understand because it's not exactly ours and for us and for our time. However, the way that it appears is that, this is talking about preparing for Christ to eventually come, as we read in the Gospels, as we consider during this Advent season. These 490 years symbolize something. One thing is, in the Hebrew law, there was what was called a Sabbath year. You've heard me discuss before the Sabbath and creation, time of rest. Then, when it became part of the Jewish law, the Sabbath day was, the idea is they worked as slaves in Egypt. Now they're going to learn what rest is according to the Sabbath day. Well, the Sabbath year, every Sabbath year was somewhat similar. The ground was supposed to rest, and there were certain other things that were supposed to be done during that sabbatical year. Well, what would happen is after 7 Sabbaths, so a Sabbath is the 7th year, so after 7 of these, 49 years, would come the year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee, all debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and everything was economically reset. And so when debts were freed, it meant that if somebody lost their land because of debt, the debt is forgiven and their land is returned back to them. So within this idea of 490 years, I realize it's probably hard to follow, and it's more than likely that I'm doing an inadequate job of letting the material flow and explaining it. But you'll see these 70 weeks, these 490 years in Daniel. Daniel's being told that the exile is going to last that long. But, so what happens after 490 years is there's the idea of 10 jubilees that occur. So it's going to be the mother of all Sabbaths, right after 70 times 7. And it's going to be the father of all jubilees, 10 of the 49 cycles to make 10 jubilees. There's going to be a significant jubilee. It's interesting that when Peter asked Jesus, how many times are we to forgive? 70 times 7. That there's an echo of this. It's also even more pertinent that when Jesus in Luke's gospel is the only one that articulates this, but when Jesus gives his first sermon in Nazareth in Luke chapter 4, what Jesus is doing is quoting from Isaiah 61, where it is using the language of the Jubilee. Jesus sees himself as being the fulfillment of these 490 years in Daniel chapter 9, when it was awaiting the Father, and of all jubilees, Jesus came and was giving the message of the Jubilee, which meant forgiveness of debts, and that's why Jesus in Luke's version used debt language and parables for the parable of the debtor. Why he used debt language in Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive the debts of others. In the first century, the word debt and sin were virtually synonymous. This is why, Jesus was calling exiles home. If he could reach beyond the margins to those that were exiled from society and show that God is welcoming those back home, essentially, it demonstrates that God can welcome and is welcoming everyone back home. And so, with these 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9, as challenging and as cryptic as it all is, it speaks to a time when Jesus becomes the fulfillment, bringing the end to that exile. And it did not mean what in Daniel 9 they would have thought it meant, that they were going to have sovereignty back over their land, and that their geopolitical circumstances were all of a sudden going to stabilize. The way Christ fulfilled this was in much broader terms. That God was at peace with creation, sins were forgiven, exiles were returning home, rather than there being sacred land, a nation of people. The church was constructed, a place that is not limited to geographical boundaries and markers, but that has spread throughout the earth, hopefully articulating the message that God is at peace with creation, and that sins are forgiven, and that exiles can now return and be restored. Okay, there are 3 more readings, chapter number 10 tomorrow. If you've got any questions, comments, anything you want me to address, I realize this is hardly that detailed of attention, but I believe you have to give a big picture view some of the times, oftentimes. And so I'll try to synthesize all of this material at some point in these final sessions. Thank you all for joining with me. See you again tomorrow.